We just sort of assume life needs light, right? Photons, to survive, to evolve. It feels like biology 101. But what if? What if that's not quite right? What if the real key, the fundamental thing for life is, well, something else entirely? So today we're doing a deep dive based on this really interesting source. Life thrives on motion, not photons.
Mm-hmm.
We want to challenge that light-first assumption, explore this idea that life might actually be built on structured motion, predictable patterns.
Yeah.
Okay, so if it's not photons, how does this source explain, well, what is fundamental?
Well, what's fascinating here, and the core argument, is that life fundamentally requires structured motion, not necessarily photons. Yeah. And the source makes a strong case by pointing out, countless organisms that demonstrate this. They thrive without any photon-based vision, no sunlight dependence at all.
Okay.
Just think about the sheer variety of life in complete darkness. You've got the Texas blind salamander, the Mexican tetra, the olm, even the Kauai cave wolf spider, blind mole rats, sea urchins too. Their entire existence, it hinges on interpreting rhythmic environmental motion.
Motion like what exactly?
Things like sensing vibrations, subtle fluid flows, chemical gradients, pressure changes. They're essentially built on detecting these rhythms. It really makes you think about those deep caves or ocean floors, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Life isn't just barely hanging on there.
Exactly. It's thriving, just using a completely different sensory toolkit based on motion.
That's a really compelling point for those specific creatures adapted to darkness. But what about something we think of as more universal, like vision? Eyes seem so critical.
Right, and that's a key point the source addresses. It raises this important question about vision's role. Vision, which we often see as absolutely fundamental, is framed here more as an evolutionary specialization.
A specialization, not essential.
Not fundamentally essential, according to this view. The really surprising insight is that eyes aren't just passive photon catchers. They're actually incredibly sophisticated motion detectors.
Yeah.
They evolved to pick up on specific rhythmic patterns that light helps reveal.
So even vision is ultimately about detecting motion patterns.
That's the idea. Light becomes a medium for detecting environmental rhythms and structures.
Okay, that reframes sight quite a bit. But here's something that always seemed odd. Those non-photosynthetic bacteria that still sense light. If they don't use light for energy, why bother detecting it? Traditional biology finds that a bit puzzling.
Yeah, it is a bit of a head-scratcher usually, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, this motion theory...
Which says everything is structured rhythmic motion.
Exactly. That theory offers a pretty clear explanation. These bacteria, they aren't fundamentally sensing photons in the way we might think, like for information or energy directly. Instead, they're likely detecting rhythmic environmental cues that just happen to be correlated with light.
Correlated? Like what?
Like subtle temperature cycles that follow day-night patterns, or maybe chemical oscillations in their environment, even tiny surface disturbances linked to light changes. Their photon-sensing proteins, in this view, are really acting to synchronize the bacteria's internal metabolism with these external rhythms.
So it's about timing, synchronization with the environment's pulse.
Precisely. It's about rhythm, driven by cues often associated with light. But the fundamental driver is the rhythm itself, the motion pattern.
The source also talks about a way to test this, right? An experiment.
Yes, a pretty straightforward one, conceptually. Imagine taking some common organisms, maybe yeast or hydra or slime molds, and you put them in complete darkness, total black.
Right, no photons.
But then you expose them to consistent, structured, rhythmic stimuli, things like, say, regular vibrations or pulses of a chemical.
So rhythmic motion cues instead of light.
Exactly. And if these organisms don't just survive, but actually thrive, if they grow, reproduce, organize...
Then that would strongly suggest.
It would be pretty conclusive evidence, yeah. That structured motion, the rhythm, is the fundamental requirement for their persistence, not the photons themselves.
No. Okay. So pulling this all together, but what's the big takeaway here?
I think the overarching conclusion is quite profound, really. It suggests life fundamentally depends on structured motion and rhythmic synchronization. That's the bedrock. Photons, vision, all of that. They're incredibly useful, highly advanced adaptations, but they're layered on top of this foundational motion-based infrastructure.
So it really reshapes the core of biology.
It does, and it aligns neatly with that broader motion theory principle, that everything fundamentally is structured rhythmic motion. From atoms to organisms to galaxies.
So after this deep dive, it really feels like looking at life through a completely different lens. Not light-centric, but motion-centric, rhythm-centric.
Absolutely. It shifts the focus dramatically. And maybe, it leaves us with a thought to consider. How might seeing motion as life's foundation change how you observe the world? Might you start noticing hidden rhythms, subtle patterns of motion in places you never really looked for them before?